Hi, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today. And I'll be joined today by none other than Terry Flew. Terry is a professor of communication and creative industries at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. And this past year, Terry was the president of the International Communication Association, overseeing its transition to a virtual conference, among many other things. And Terry is widely known all over the world for writing some of the key handbooks of our discipline on media economics, on the global creative industries and the creative industries policies, creative industries management, creative industries institutions around the world. He's written lucid introductions to new media, um, to the global media and the global media industries and their impact on the world today. And specifically written also about the role of media policies in helping us understand and appreciate what it is that media do and do not do in our societies, in our lives. Making the argument often about how significant, what the continued significance is of the nation and the nation state when we consider the global in our media. And we'll be talking about a whole host of issues today. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Specifically, I'm really excited to hear from Terry about, as you'll hear in the interview, about how the future of universities in our sector is so similar to the future of our conferences, considering the role of the climate change, the increasing cost of global academia, and of course the ongoing concerns with the coronavirus and future pandemics. We'll also be talking about the significance of shared narratives between the people who make media and the people who use media. Our future relationship with our media is not just based on truth, it's very much also based on trust. And we'll conclude our conversation with a brief reflection on a topic very near and dear to my heart, which is love and the role it plays in helping us move forward in our digital culture that seems to be dominated by large multinational digital platforms, but also is not. Sit back and enjoy the ride today. So, hello, Terry. Very, very good to see you.
Wonderful to be here talking with you, Mark.
And thanks so much for doing this and for joining. I just want to dive right into something that is very much related to this thing that we're doing now, this sort of online video conferencing and video calling. I mean, you've just completed your tenure as president of the International Communication Association, and during this time, you've overseen this transition from our association to a completely virtual annual conference in your own country, in Australia. How does this time feel for you if you look back on this transition and on your year as the president of the ICA overseeing this? What are your thoughts?
Well, it was definitely a year of two parts. So if I go back to late January, early February, the big conversation we're having was about the pros and cons of the ICA dance party. And what was the surprisingly high cost of having a few bouncers stand around outside the venue at the casino.
Always a lot of fun.
By March, that's right. By March, of course, the world changed. The world changed very quickly. And I think from the ICA's point of view, the great merit, and this was, led by Laura Sawyer and Claes de Vries, we worked kind of kitchen cabinet on it, was to move quickly.
Right.
So we made the decision on March the 13th, and it was interesting that, as you'd recall, the peaks come later in the US than they came in other parts of the world. So there was a sense that, it was a relatively early call in terms of where the state of discussion was in the US, but certainly I think in Europe, the outbreak in Italy had really brought home just how, serious and how pervasive this was.
Right.
So that, but moving early, as well as covering for financial costs associated with deposits on hotels and so on, also, gave us the time to really think through what was to be done. That said, it was a virtual conference created in 9 weeks. So it was very rapid movement around it and very demanding on the staff involved. We are getting the outcomes of it, but first observations I'd have would be, well, first of all, people do miss not meeting one another and the physical proximity. At the same time, we started to follow what was going to happen with other conferences, because once ICA moved, other conferences felt the need to respond. And there are other conferences that were saying, well, we'll have a face-to-face conference because we believe in face-to-face conferences. Well, you can believe you saw Jesus riding a dinosaur wearing a MAGA hat, but your ability to actually do it is a different thing. So we're moving quickly. We know that we think that people consumed a lot more content. So we said, think about this as being more like Netflix. And so there was an ICA binge hashtag that was very active. And I think also people were consuming content that they probably would not have engaged with in the face-to-face context. So it shook up a little bit one of the perennial question marks around ICA, which is that with so many fairly specialised divisions and interest groups, do you get a silo effect within the organisation where people identify more with being in, Division X than the association as a whole and tend towards staying within that group for, reasons where they're presented with huge amounts of choice. You tend to go with the familiar.
Do you even think that one of the typical debates of an academic discipline as it matures is that it becomes so specialized in all kinds of, like you said, silos. It becomes confident in specific knowledge areas, that its annual gatherings and its journals and its publications don't really speak to each other anymore. And that perhaps this online component, at least the experience of this year, suggests that people might actually dip their toe into different disciplinary waters a bit more, just because they can, and they're not distracted perhaps by constantly bumping into their friends at the venue.
I think there's some of that. I think that, and Sylvia Wasteboard has written about this quite a bit recently, there is that need to fight against the siloisation, because you've got the issue, it's a bit like departments in universities, that they provide you with an organisational track,
right,
if you like, and going outside of that track always entails risks. So I think there's parallel issues. In fact, I think there's a lot of parallel issues around the future of conferences and events and the future of universities. So I think there's a number of comparable questions that they're facing that Claes de Vries has described as the 3 Cs. One is obviously COVID-19. The second is climate. And we were certainly getting some expressions of concern about the climate impact of long distance travel. And the third is cost, that virtually every university will be facing a more resource-constrained environment post-2020, that if what's currently going on is deglobalisation, this will particularly hit universities because they were very much bound, they have been very much bound up with the globalisation project, as we both know from our respective institutions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
It's
and I'll just add on that, the
please.
other big issue, of course, is hybrid delivery. Well, what follows from that is hybrid delivery models.
It's interesting because it speaks to something that I've always experienced in your work, is the juxtaposition of seemingly completely opposite perspectives, and where you show how they have a long history of being actually much more interdependent than we sometimes make them out to be. In this case, for example, deglobalization and globalization that happen in different ways simultaneously, whether online or offline. And in your presidential address, that is now, of course, that lives online forever on YouTube and other platforms. You talk about, and I thought that was really beautiful, that all the concerns right now in this infodemic as well as pandemic about truthful information and getting people to access the right information is of course an important endeavor, and the fight against fake news and all that kind of stuff. But you link it very explicitly to trust, right? That the truth is just not enough. I mean, if you can tell people the truth, but if they don't trust you, then it's not going to happen. Now, I wonder, specifically inspired by your presidential address, like, how do you see the role of professional storytellers in getting getting people to build on shared narratives rather than their own micro narratives? And not just journalists. I mean, journalists, of course, are the first people we turn to, but also filmmakers or even game developers or ad creators. What is their role? And I ask you specifically because you've written so much about the media and the global creative industries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can't... it's particularly a time where it's very hard to just leave this to journalists, partly because of the crisis of commercial news business models, of course. Partly also because, the distrust of mainstream media is pervasive, and like, populist anti-elitism generally, not unfounded. That we find evidence of elite corruption at many points, and simply writing it off as populism, may miss the point about quite a lot of things. I'm struck with there's a couple of things about, the demand for accurate information that there feels like there's something a bit Reithian about it. That just as in the first part of the 20th century, we said, well, we need, a paternalist state to run broadcasting because otherwise this powerful technology may be misused. Now there's no demand for that, but there's almost a kind of a, whack-a-mole going on, that we try and get, inaccurate information and suppress it. And we know that there's always problems with the suppression strategy. That I think we have a tendency to approach this question from a supply side point of view. So if only we could, and I can almost hear Kant, the ghost of Kant in this. If only we could weed out the bad information, we'd then have the good information, and we'd again become an informed citizenry. Well, the point is that the bad information circulates in the way it does. It's not just, the Russians or Steve Bannon or, China or whoever it might be. It's because there's demand for it. And I worry that in our field, we may not be paying enough attention to the sources of that demand. I think I think, we have a legacy that deep down, we tend to think of the public as rational, or that at any rate not manipulate. We're very reluctant to concede that people can be manipulated by information, because that sounds like, earlier paradigms that we often rejected. But I think we might need to be engaging a bit more, certainly with some of the literature on populism, which does address this, but also with fields like social psychology. I think that their insights into, concepts like cognitive bias, probably we need to come back and have a look at some of those. I think that we lack a theory. I think that the discussion around fake news, misinformation, and so on runs the risk of lacking a theory of the subject.
Right. And how, I'm just going to swing back to I mean, and I have a bit of preoccupation perhaps with the professional storytellers in all of this. But I really take your point about not making this a supplied side issue exclusively. Would a potential solution be in pushing harder in something that is happening piecemeal in several media professions, where media professionals are beginning to co-create with audiences? As you know, Henry Jenkins has worked on this a lot from the perspective of fan studies. We know, especially also in Australia, quite a few colleagues have been working on this from the perspectives of Indigenous and community media, and collaborative sort of production practices. And I mean, in other words, getting people to make media together could amplify or increase trust levels in how the media report on them, whether that's in film.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think it needs to be more than just a news-based strategy. Right. Yeah, I think more than simply, I mean, it's interesting because public health officials are generally quite trusted, it seems. But if you look at the communities least likely to be responsive to the official health messages, and in Australia, certainly, this tends to be migrant communities. There's been, among Indigenous communities, to get this message across, it's needed Indigenous spokespeople, and there's actually been some very important successes with that, but a distrust of the mainstream there. Lower income communities, and people who have had ongoing dealings with the health system that they haven't been happy about. So simply, a crisis always reveals other things, and so a lot of those questions about how you would better get messages into communities that are not engaged with or somewhat resistant to dominant narratives. I think you're absolutely right. You need people from within those communities engaging actively, working with those groups, and you need something more than simply news or instruction. You need, you do need some kind of co-creation of a narrative there.
This combination of perspectives for me is very typical of your work, right? Because you, I mean, beyond writing a couple of books that are used at universities all over the world, where you truly provide broad perspectives, in a lot of also your papers, you integrate perspectives on, the global media, culture, and creative industries. With perspectives on the state and especially the role of policies, cultural and media policies and policies in general, with notions of creativity and innovation, and a theoretical framework that often runs through this is a political economy approach, but not the traditional political economy approach. It's really interesting how you sort of provide an historical background to that offers much more than a sort of a macro level perspective, if you will. Now, I know this is a broad question, so I apologize for that in advance, Terry. But this combination of perspectives, right, of the industries on the one hand, the role of the state and policy on the other hand, and creativity and innovation, and the incredibly important role that plays in making everything move and everything go. And I mean, from combining those perspectives, what are some of the key insights, or perhaps a key example for you that has really brought you the integration of perspective that really brought you forward in your thinking as a scholar?
I've found always found an interesting and sometimes difficult tension, which is that globalization encourages us towards a very macro paradigm. But for that to hold, the corollary tends to be that the nation state is in decline. Now, I've long questioned that argument. In fact, it was going back a long time, project with John Hartley and others on creative industries in China. But the pretext was China's entry into the WTO in 2001. And I was very struck by the fact that for China to enter the WTO, it wasn't ceding sovereignty at all.
Right.
Basically, I'm very aware that the WTO couldn't make China do anything, really. Can't make America do anything either. These global institutions are only as powerful as the states that underpin them. But globalization within China enabled changes within China. And I think probably from seeing a similar process in Australia in the 1980s and 1990s, you could see how this opening up to global institutions is not necessarily a ceding of power to them, but rather enables a sort of internal reconfiguration. So that sense that you've got globalization, but also clearly different nation states are doing things differently. And that this dimension matters, even though it's hard to capture because, you know, you don't, in writing terms, you don't want to come to those sort of books that, you know, A is for Andorra or Afghanistan and Z is for Zambia and Zimbabwe, and you cover each nation state as a kind of discrete entity. It doesn't work like that. But nation states do matter, continue to matter. I think that was my insight with regards to the internet, that, you know, we were talking about the global internet, and there was always, but what about China? And well, China's an exception. Well, it's a pretty big exception. And, you know, over time, it would become apparent that, you know, different institutional formations were emerging around the internet. Not necessarily in the same way as they emerged around 20th century media, but certainly in ways that suggest it's not something completely unparalleled in the history of media studies. So the national media systems models for their limitations continued to point to something that was significant, and that connects up also with national innovation systems and how different places have promoted their creative sectors with greater or lesser degree of effectiveness in reaching international markets.
Yeah, because that is fascinating in a way, right? Where when you see governments and states all over the world from the late 1990s up until today increasingly embracing creative industries and the creative economy and the creative sector as a key driver of economic growth or expected growth, if you will. But at the same time, as they're all sort of buying into versions of this idea, also very much using it to strengthen or even fencing off their own local creative sectors from the other one, or promoting them, using them to promote their national ideal to the world. And it's so that's actually a beautiful example, exactly what you're saying, from looking at things from both on the global level, taking in the role of the state and policies, and looking at what that does to creativity on an institutional or industrial level, if you will. Now, to extend that argument a bit, I mean, like you said, you in several publications you've made this argument, almost warning us not to forget the national level of analysis, not to forget the state and the nation state, and how that still matters despite claims towards a post-national consolation. I even recently make the argument that perhaps we're moving towards a post-global consolation where the nation becomes even more important, especially under pressure from populist politicians and movements. Now, how do you reconcile in your work, on the one hand, this push to look at the global media, at multinational media corporations and their functioning, at the creative industries writ large, and on the other hand, sort of almost pushing us as your colleagues and your students to not only not forget about the nation, but actually saying perhaps we should let go a little bit of this global and cosmopolitan vibe that these perspectives suggest, and look what's happening right around us.
It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge, and it's a particular challenge if, the largest, because we're at an interesting time in terms of our field, that the world's biggest companies now broadly sit within our field. Yeah. Okay. Apple, Google, Facebook, they're all to some, Amazon, they're all to some degree in a media related, or certainly communications related space, in a way that, say, General Motors or, McDonald's or whatever weren't necessarily. So clearly we've got these dominant global brands, if you like. I think I had a bit of an epiphany between doing the first and second editions of the Understanding Global Media book. And it was one of those ones that dawned on me in retrospect, that was concluding the second edition. I was a little bit behind on the contract, as will happen. But I think this was probably a good thing, because I concluded the book just as Trump had been elected in the US. And it was actually the business press that were first picking up on the significance of this. So The Economist, the Harvard Business Review, so on, they were the ones first talking about deglobalization, and that what united all of these disparate populisms was a discontent with an idea of a global ecumene or global episteme. And realised that when I concluded the first edition of the book in 2007, this was actually peak globalisation, the period immediately before the global financial crisis. The global institutions were only as powerful as the nation states that underwrote them. And so, and to some extent that was disguised, because this was the great era, this was the era of the great convergence. People like Thomas Friedman would talk about the golden straitjacket and whatnot, that there was a kind of shared belief in the institutions that enabled them to act. But of course, once you remove a strut from that, you remove a very large strut, like the US. And Trump's first action was to cancel the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which interestingly had been designed by the Obama administration to contain China. So it involved all of the major Pacific powers except China. And in China, people would draw your attention to this. So it was quite interesting that sort of step was the first step. And so it presented a point. Can you talk about global media if you've got this sort of backlash to globalization going on? And I think the configurations coming forward will be complicated. Now, we're not going to go back to a world of autarkic nation states. But if you're Apple and the majority of your components are manufactured in China and China's a very large market to you, but you're a US company, it's tricky times.
Right. The I was thinking about that because, I mean, to some extent, perhaps in our field, we are a little bit stuck in making sense of these multinational or global media conglomerates, because we tend to look at them from, and it's something you've pointed at quite systematically in your work, from a political economy perspective. And there is which is a very powerful and useful macro level sort of theoretical perspective that helps us understand the role of power in analyzing the role that media, especially global media, play around the world. However, it is perhaps less useful to make sense of this complex context that you're now sketching as well. And in one of your recent publications, you suggest that next to the macro level insights that political economy would engender, we also need the micro level insights that analyses of people's drives and norms and feelings and emotions would offer us. And you've hinted at that before in our conversation today. I mean, how do we combine the study of emotions and people's desires, if you will, and passions on the one hand with a political economy perspective and making sense of the role that media play in our societies?
Yeah, I'd add a third layer to that, which is the miso layer, or the layer of institutions and organisations. And it is, anthropologists like Mary Douglas talked about this, the extent to which our identities are formed by the institutions that we find ourselves in. I think that's another layer. And of course, the nation state is a set of institutions as well as an idea. So I think it's the intersection of those three levels that's important. And it's been interesting for me to go back and look at how trust has been discussed in communications journals. So Journal of Communication, we've worked out, it's carried somewhere in the range of about 120 articles over its history that deal directly with the question of trust.
Right.
But again, and it comes back to this, the layers of the discipline come up here. So you get the kind of macro studies of trust, what's with the public sphere, what's the future of journalism, those Russian interference in elections, those sort of big macro topics. You get the classic micro studies around intergroup and interpersonal. So how does, say, a newly formed, say, African migrant community adapt in, a large city in the Netherlands or Australia? So classic interpersonal, intergroup communications. Then you've got those that run in between, and you had quite a surge in studies around, not surprisingly, the internet and trust and social media and trust. And these were very often grounded in particular institutional or organisational contexts. So there's quite a large org-com literature in this field, for instance, that may not be so apparent if one works primarily in journalism or political communication. And and right now, of course, it's a boom topic because fake news, misinformation, populism, all point to trust crises.
Right.
That said, I think one of the curious things about communications is it hasn't, when you look at literature on trust, you don't find communications being strongly foregrounded. You absolutely find sociology, so classic sociology, Weber, Simmel, Durkheim, going forward to Giddens, Beck, uh, of course. You find there's literature in economics on trust.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's literature in political science on trust as well, and philosophy. In communication, it's often been within something else.
Right.
So it's within theories of the public sphere, or it's within theories of mediated populism or fake news. It's embedded in something else. And I've been wrestling with this question about to what extent does our field focus on truth and as distinct from trust. That the two are clearly connected, but they're also possibly conceptually distinct, not least because after Foucault, it's always been hard to have a kind of universal read on the truth.
Right. So in this case, if we would include people's, as you say, people's feelings, desires, their social norms, their way of being in the world, with our studies of truth, if you will, or of systems or structures or institutional practices, we actually get a much richer understanding of such a complicated issue such as trust, for example, or we can actually say much more about what is actually the real problem about fake news. Perhaps not that it's not truthful, but that people choose to trust other things.
Or where does the anger stem from that fuels distrust?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's, and I think it's comforting to believe it's conspiracy theories. Now, conspiracy theories are absolutely there. And, I don't know if you're getting this in the Netherlands, but in Australia, we're getting lots of people shooting on their phone images of people declaring the UN Declaration on Human Rights gives them the right not to wear a mask in a hardware store, that sort of thing, which is kind of both sad and amusing.
Yeah.
But I've been reading Thomas Piketty recently, his most recent book, and I would say you can probably skip the first 800 pages and get right to the last part. I'm always struck by this guy. He's the global expert on inequality, but he must have the world's largest research lab in order to generate all the data that he does. But the data on voting patterns is really very striking and very consistent, which is that parties of the left and centre-left became, over a 50-year period, the parties of the educated. And it's the most marked shift in voting preferences, and it's consistent across all of the countries that he studies. So you've got it's not so much that parties of the right become parties of the less educated. You can see the tensions all around the world in conservative politics around that, whether to become Trumpian or not. But you then get this sort of groundswell of those who feel unrepresented. What would be called the left behind. So he has this data on voting patterns around the UK Brexit referendum.
Right.
And the correlation between, well, it's there with income as well, but it's especially there with education. The correlation between that and whether you voted yes or no is really stark. And so you'd get those things. On the one hand, after the result, people would be on Twitter saying, well, I don't know anyone who voted no. And on the other hand, you'd get, someone quoted in a pub saying, there was no one, everyone here was going to vote no.
Right. So Terry, in conclusion, I want to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's just one reference in your presidential address, and but it is to an author that you cited in other papers a bit more extensively. But I think it's such a beautiful and important reference, and I just wanted to pick your brains on it, which is to Hirschman, and you make it's just a very subtle little comment that if we want to connect the truth to trust, that one way of doing that, one way of understanding that, is to understand trust also in terms of love.
Mm-hmm.
And that really struck me as a very powerful point. This notion of, I mean, like, for example, in the context of the examples you just sketched, I mean, people who voted for Trump or voted for Brexit, also, they just also, you could argue they didn't feel loved by those who were governing them into a direction where they felt, as you said, left behind or unseen. And what else is that than not feeling loved? Right? If you feel you're not seen, you're not taken seriously, you're ignored, you're disrespected, you're not loved. Now, how can we, as communication and media scholars, engage with love, with the topic of love? I mean, what would that look like? What would that be? I mean, how can we use that? I mean, my first instinct is to think about fan studies. I mean, we have a long history in our field of people who study, but that's a very particular topic, and it's often also almost seen as a sort of a problematic, like an extreme type of media use, like the fanatic, right? But it's somebody who clearly loves something about their media, whether it's a band or an actor or a character or whatnot. But I mean, how? I mean, I know I'm pushing you perhaps in a direction that I don't know, but it's. I thought it was such a key reference in your speech, and it really inspired me. But would you mind sharing your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, Hirschman's always, it's great. It's just fascinating, his insights on so many things. I think it's is it being loved or being is connected isn't quite the right word, but I'm thinking about influencer communities, not so much people who go to get paid $1,000 to go to the Fire Festival type influencers, but I'm thinking about those celebrities and others who have very large followings on their platforms. And what Cristiano Ronaldo,
right?
Millions of people, my daughter included, follow Cristiano Ronaldo on Instagram. There's a connection. There's a connection that's being made there. I think it's a connection that can be easily broken. I think the sense of the cynicism, and I'm watching The Great Hack right at the moment, but sort of the cynicism that people perceive when Mark Zuckerberg would say, well, we're building a global community, and we want to connect people to one another. Well, we want their data points. That's what we want. Right. But that, I think that sense of a sort of genuine connected, I think there is a certain fragility around that. I think we're in a very interesting time in some respects. That certainly one of the things we're seeing in Australia in 2020 is this rediscovery of regional Australia. So, while Australia is a very large place, 80% of its population live on the coastline. And for the most part, they're not flying at the moment. So there's a lot of driving around. There's a lot of people relocating to the regions. It will be interesting to see if this lasts. But there's a certain degree of it's a not Richard Florida moment, if I was to put it that way.
Right.
There's the idea the creatives all had to be in, big urban agglomerations, we did a project on creative suburbia, and so there was always something actually wrong with that.
Right.
Creative people quite quite like the suburbs and the regions, but they don't all wear turtlenecks. Yeah. So, but there was. But there is this, it's an interesting trend about whether people want to be connecting up with people. But they do this alongside this search for connectedness on platforms, which is, of course, dangerous because there's a cynicism that lies behind a lot of that. That I think we're not naive to the political economy of platforms,
right?
But there is nonetheless a search for connectedness going on there that could be the basis for something hopeful.
I think that's a beautiful statement to conclude our conversation. Even though there's so much here, we could talk for a lot more time, a lot more hours. So thanks so much, Terry, for joining me today and for taking the time to talk about your work. Really appreciate it. And see you very soon.
Thank you, Mark. Such a pleasure. Yes.